Hunter's not here to start us off. I don't know where Hunter is.
Can
We don't.
can I bring up something
Sure.
with Hunter not here? And I'm bringing it up because it seems like it doesn't fit this last section. It's the fifth section, but it's the proposition 23. The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains, which is eternal. In this version of it, it's page 172. The one that's published by Penguin Classics. The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains, which is eternal. Which I just think that's a very interesting proposition, but the other propositions seem to be connected to, earthly finiteness. And this is saying, well, no, there's actually a part that is eternal. So
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is kind of like bringing us all the way back to the beginning in a certain way, where it's like, hey, we're all just a piece of this grand God or nature, right? And I mean, he's got a couple of caveats in here that I thought were kind of interesting. Like, you, the person thinking right now, don't really exist, but it's almost like a shadow of you, or maybe even more importantly, like whatever core element of God you are exemplifying persists because God continues to persist. And your death of your body doesn't really change anything on his side. You're just no longer exemplifying those characteristics. So while, yeah, at first I was thinking like, whoa, are we getting into some kind of like afterlife here? It doesn't really seem to be like anything like a kind of like a traditional afterlife. It's very much this, shadow on the wall. You persist because you were a part of God this entire time, and that's where he derives all this from. Is that correct, Chase?
Yeah. So I guess I kind of read this as it's his version of the afterlife, which is indeed a very unorthodox version of it. I mean, it diverges from the traditional idea of immortality in some interesting ways, but I think that's what he's playing off that concept, that traditional concept of the immortal soul. Although he's not, I think there's only one section where he's really explicit about something like, this is the common way that people tend to think of the mind as something eternal and indivisible, and leave it at that. But so this proposition 23 and this section, so he says, I don't know why you can kind of understand why he does phrase it this way, but I think the way that he puts these phrasings in the proposition and then explains the caveat, the qualification of it in the demonstration, but it's unnecessarily confusing, I think, in my opinion at least.
so I'm begging your pardon, go ahead.
Yeah, so he's saying that there's the human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, something of it remains, which is eternal. And then he talks in throughout here about that there's an aspect of the mind that is eternal, that can be outside the body in some sense. And that seems to break with the parallelism in a pretty major way. So this is where, once again, it's this essence and existence. This is the distinction that's really important. So there's an eternal essence for your body and parallelism. You've also got an idea, and that idea expresses the essence also of your body. So you have an eternal part of your body, the essence, and you have an eternal part of your mind, which is the intellect. And those are connected through parallelism. They each will express a unity, which is in the individual. And that's your eternal aspect, I guess. And so that's the aspect that he's concerned about, really trying to talk about in the second half of the fifth part here, which seems pretty difficult to do, to talk about eternity and whatnot. Okay, but what's the other aspect? So then existence. So there's existing parts, or an existing mode that corresponds with the essence for the body and for the mind. So those are two distinct things. Is the essence, which is going to be that's going to be this relation that I keep talking about, that it's the relation of motion and rest, speed and slowness, that characterizes our power of being affected, our power of acting. And so that he really only describes this in detail in the section on bodies, the second part. But that's why I think that part is so important, because that's really describing what the essence is in a certain detail. But then it also gets more complicated, because what's important, especially in these kind of epistemological ways of talking about it, is how it connects with these other ideas. So that for a reason, the second kind of knowledge, you've got this building up of common notions through reason. And that works in a way where you're starting with the more particular of just your body as it exists, connected with some other body. And then from there, you try to build them up to be more and more general, more and more universal. But the third kind of knowledge, that's going to be something going in the opposite direction, where he says that you first have to have an adequate idea of the attribute, and then from the attribute, you determine how is it that then the essence of singular things follow from the adequate idea of the attribute. So it's working from this kind of unfolding of the attribute to the unfolding of singular ideas that is not necessarily just between your body and another. And this is what he thinks as these eternal essences. And that's how this third type of knowledge works. So where does existence come in there? So existence is kind of its own. I don't think Spinoza sees it this way. It's a continuity with existence and essence, although it's difficult to understand how that kind of jump happens, I guess. But so existence, that has to do with duration. And this has to do with extensive parts. So this is where you've got, the infinite chains of determination, where you have these external parts that just determine me to come into the relation that is my essence. So my essence as this relation of motion and rest, this proportion, a ratio, a differential ratio, this is a eternal truth. But the thing is, in existence, when it takes on these parts in duration, then I exist. So then you've got this coexistence of your modal existence, the parts that realize your essence, the relation. And you've got then, of course, the relation itself as the eternal truth of your essence. And yeah.
I thought, and what you're saying makes me think I'm wrong. So what I was thinking is that, I am a collection of parts, and that collection makes an individual because of these relations, like you said, of motion and rest that allow this collection of parts to cohere as an individual. But then I thought that over the course of my life, that particular constituents of this individual could change. In other words, like, this little part might go away and this other little part might come in. But if my essence, my eternal essence, is defined by a set of relations, then it seems that if the parts change, then the relations would have to change too, because now I've got a new part. Or would he say that, like, every time I lose one part, exactly one more part comes in, so that the set of relations persists eternally, or what? I mean, so I guess my basic question is, if the parts that make me change, why don't the eternal, why do the relations that constitute my essence remain constant or eternal?
Yeah, so the way he sees it is that it's something like a proportion where the particular, say, the values, the amount, those can change. And also in this case, I think the very particular, say, particles that make up your body or whatnot, those can change. But as long as the basic proportion, the basic way that the movements kind of cohere together, as long as that stays relatively within a certain kind of threshold, between these different thresholds that allow you to keep that integration of your body together and survive and maintain your power of acting and whatnot, as long as that remains, then the parts will be recycled, and they have to be recycled.
But if over the course of my life, when my body physically changes dramatically, so just in size, from the size of an infant to the size of an adult, you're saying even in that radical change of what appears to be change of parts, there's still these proportions that remain constant throughout that?
Yeah, so he actually mentions this leap between the infant, the child, and the adult, and says that there are cases where, there's actually a shift, there's a change. So these things can take on new relations. So
that would mean
that way we are different individuals.
Okay.
From infancy to adulthood, it seems like he's saying. And the same way, we can also so we can die in this technical sense that he talks about, where dying is you have a new essence, a new relation of your body. So we can die while still being biologically alive in the normal way we think about it.
And so there would be an eternal essence for each of those, like when you go from this change to that change, you die in this form and come alive in this form, that both of those relations would constitute eternal essences then that remain in God?
Yeah, I think so.
At the very bottom of page 178 and up on page 179, I this is where he's trying to explain, in this life then we strive especially that the infant's body may change as much as its nature allows, and assist into another capable of a great many things and related to a mind very much conscious of itself, of God, and of things. We strive, that is, that whatever is related to its memory or imagination is hardly any moment in relation to the intellect. So is he when you were talking, Chase, it seems like those things that we occupy our mind with that aren't necessarily connected to our own individual personal experience, but rather we're trying to think in the broadest, I don't want to say necessarily the most general or the most abstract, but that's where we're getting closer to the eternal.
Yeah, I think so. So I should say that this exact debate about the essences and is very much debated among Spinoza scholars, and it's pretty tricky. Also, even the Latin is a little ambiguous. It seems to the so I mean, definitely it's something supposed to be eternal, but he also has this word basically that currently translates it as fixed, but it can also be translated as determined or even reciprocal, related. So that makes it somewhat difficult to understand exactly what is going on with, okay, well, what is this? Does it stay exactly the same? In what sense? But he definitely Spinoza seems to say that there's a kind of minimum and maximum kind of, of a continuum where you can kind of shift between these things. But, and I think especially with your power of acting, the way that joy can increase this, sadness can decrease it. I think that is something that, okay, how do you explain that? I think that kind of goes within that kind of distribution there that would cover your essence as this differential relation that nevertheless still stays the same as far as it's a proportion, a ratio. So there's Spinoza, he wrote some letters kind of explain this a little more in detail, and he used some ideas from basically kind of a forerunner of calculus, and this is something that Leibniz kind of thought was interesting about Spinoza. But he seems to have thought that it is something like a differential relation where it's this proportion that it's independent of the exact things that are being related. So you could have the same proportion, but then as long as the proportion stays the same, but you can have any kind of values as the coefficients. So I don't know math actually that well. I've been trying desperately to very little success to learn a little bit, but I think that's one way to think about it. In that, yeah, you can still have these recycling of parts, and you can also have this variation and a kind of flexibility or a kind of elasticity with this relation, especially as far as it exists, and it exists within, it has to increase, it has to decrease as far as it exists in duration. So yeah, this basic distinction between essence and existence is extremely important for understanding, I think, a lot about this entire book, and especially this idea of the third kind of knowledge and these eternal parts of the mind and the body that are eternal. So they're, can you say it's alive, so if we're talking about a afterlife, I don't think he would want to say that, because I mean, this is part of the problem, that our language, for reasons that are very, well, somewhat obvious, they're full of temporal ways of talking. You can't really get outside of it. So thinking of something that's like afterlife, after this, before this, that obviously makes no sense, because he's talking about this idea of eternity, which is, too often we conceive of that as just an extended amount of duration. And that's exactly what he's challenging, which is a pretty common thing, I think. So I remember reading Boethius, if anyone knows that is, and he makes that distinction about, oh yeah, well, God isn't everlasting, but God is eternal, and eternal means something very different from, duration, everlastingness, is that's how we normally conceive it. And also, if you're thinking in terms of before and after, that's obviously not going to make any sense with what he's talking about. It's a weird concept, but yeah.
Aquinas has this interesting argument for why, God is supposed to be changeless. Of course, he doesn't have the same conception of God as Spinoza, but God is supposed to be changeless. And so there's this criticism. Well, how can you say that God is changeless if God created the world? Because the act of creation would imply a change in, that there's something changed. And what Aquinas says, very cleverly, is prior to the creation, there was no time. And, so God, like you're saying, God is eternal, but there is no time, which means there is no change. And so at the moment of creation, you can't say that's a change, because there was no time prior to the initiation of the creation. Time begins at the point of the creation. And so you can't, like you said, you can't really say prior to the creation, because since the state of eternity is atemporal, then there isn't a before the creation. There's just time starts. And so, there was no change in God, because there was no time prior to the creation. So, so that's how he solves that problem. But I think it's a similar way of thinking, that state of eternity is not an infinite duration. It's a state of atemporality.
Mm. Yeah, so I don't think this idea necessarily works, I'll just say. So one thing is, okay, so he says that certain things are eternal by way of their cause. So first we've got substance. Okay, fine. It's eternal. You can say that. Attributes, okay, yeah, they express the essence of substance. Grant that. Okay, now infinite median modes, where we're talking about all motion and rest for the attribute of extension. So this would have to be eternal also, by way that its cause is in the attributes. So now we've got all motion and rest. We've got this mode. Now we go into finite modes. Those, in some sense, are caused by the infinite mode, which is eternal. So it seems like it should say that that aspect is eternal as well, that is caused by that. I think that's what he says is that's your essence, that's eternal too. But then where exactly does time come in? How does it emerge from any of these things? If everything is caused by something that's eternal and things are eternal by their cause, where's time coming from? Is it has to be, caused by something eternal, right? Which I think is something also kind of strange that so he says, there's the affections that occur in time, in duration. These aren't part of our essence, but then they're caused by things that are eternal, right? So then, and they're eternal in some sense, perhaps. I don't know. It's I gravitate towards process philosophy in the sense that I think you have to conceive of time as primary, metaphysically primary. Is how else can you explain that time emerges out of atemporality? It seems like you're always going to have to talk about something in terms of time occurring in something that is atemporal. Yeah. So I don't know, but
So are you saying, I put this in the chat, but are you saying that this is something that Spinoza scholars are still struggling with, or that like this question of how does time emerge from eternity, or do they have
so I mean, I'm more just saying this out of my own kind of personal reflections, but yeah, so his notion of eternal, it's this third kind of knowledge, and this idea of kind of like an eternal essence that is, there's a lot of debate about it, and a lot of people, scholars, believe that it's not really a coherent concept, or it's kind of, they a lot of reservations about it somewhat. So I was reading Beth Lord's Guide to the Ethics, and so she says some pretty interesting things, and I kind of picked up that Spinoza talks about fictions in this section, and it's kind of, what's going on here? So this is what, let's see if I can read this as Beth Lord wrote. Okay, but her reading is that the ethics is written from the second kind of knowledge, and that Spinoza he has not attained the third level, and that's why it's, in her words, I think somewhat incoherent, but it's intentionally incoherent, and that he's trying to explain that, our ways of thinking are conditioned by duration as long as we exist. So we can't really think through this third kind of knowledge as something eternal as long as we're still existing, because we'll always have these coordinates of duration and the existing body and mind that are keeping us to this order of, I don't know, it's kind of easy to think of it in sort of a Kantian way, as, got these forms of intuition by which we come to know things through time. I think that makes a little more sense in terms of, is Spinoza making that claim? Not necessarily, but I think he's, according to Beth Lord at least, who's also a Kant scholar, he is saying something similar to that, but in a way that it's kind of this performative contradiction that is illustrating something positive about the third kind of knowledge as eternal and how it's incongruent with our normal ways of thinking. And that's why Spinoza refers to these fictions by which we imagine the mind beginning to think eternally, which doesn't make any sense, of course, that something begins eternally. You're right back there with talking in temporal terms about something that is eternal.
Right. Can I use an analogy? What if you were in a two-dimensional universe, but you are hypothesizing that there was a third dimension? Wouldn't you have to describe the third dimension in some ways within the limitations of the two dimensions? If you're talking to people who have never experienced a transcendent moment, or what one might, what was it, William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience? Well, if no one, think of Joan of Arc. She says that, the Archangel Michael, whatever, showed up. How is she going to explain that to somebody who has never been remotely connected to that experience? Of course, they would say, "Oh, well, maybe it was the devil, or maybe you're just insane, or it's so far away from their own personal experience." And so I was thinking, getting away from religion, but just the two-dimensionality and three-dimensionality. How, so is that why Spinoza is speaking about this third type of knowledge, but within the constraints of the second type of knowledge, to try to communicate that idea to more people?
Yeah, I think that works according to Beth Lord's reading, that he is it's almost kind of like okay, I hate this term, but a postmodern kind of fiction or a literary style, in the sense that it'll kind of have this ironic way of pointing to usually its own limitations in some way, or it's something, or I think it is a kind of flatland kind of thing like that, or at least that could be used as an analogy. Say, okay, I'm stuck in two-dimensional thinking, but I'm trying to explain something that is three-dimensional. So I think that definitely works as an analogy for what is going on, in the sense that he's trying to explain something eternal, but he says that, oh, I've got to use these fictions, and we have to imagine the knowledge of eternity beginning in us. So yeah, it's this is also, there's a lot of questions about, okay, is Spinoza a mystic? Because it is indeed pretty common way of talking about things as eternal in mysticism. So it seems like it. I don't know.
I know. I hesitate to say this because he wants to avoid reifying essences the way that Plato does, but the forms are supposed to be like that. You're right. The forms are atemporal. They exist in an atemporal domain, and so I'm not accusing Spinoza of being a Platonist, but I mean, in terms, it's you see this in philosophy over and over. Like Nietzsche said, we have a horror of change, and so one, he would criticize it in saying, well, we posit these changeless, eternal somethings because we have this, philosophers have this horror of change. So it seems like it recurs not only in religious contexts, but in these philosophical contexts as well.
Yeah, I think there's something kind of like that going on. Where, yeah, so the congenital defects of philosophers, according to Nietzsche, is, they lack historical sense. And I think in this case, Spinoza is guilty of that, according to, the way Nietzsche thinks of it. Yeah, people do have a horror of change, but it seems like Spinoza does affirm some aspects of, that kind of world of flux and nature and whatnot. So he says, obviously he's talking about duration and whatnot, but there's one part kind of towards the very end where he says something about life is continuous change. And also the way that he's talking about, yeah, you always are undergoing affections, and there's no kind of perfect, way of stopping and, okay, I've got it, blessedness. That's not going to occur in duration. But then that seems to lead to the question of, well, can it occur outside of duration? It seems to be that he's saying there is some way that we think and even exist in a bodily way that is not existing in this durational or temporal way, which is also a difficult thing to think about. But this seems to be so if we want to call this something like an idea of eternal life, he doesn't say that, but it would be something like, okay, the more that the greater proportion of us that exercises these active affects and that has adequate ideas and that participates in our essence more so, instead of the passive affections, which are not explained by the eternal essence, the more that my own lifestyle, when I exist, is able to be explained by my essence, which is eternal, then I will in some way subsist eternally, more so when my body, when it loses its extensive parts, its durational parts, because I've lived in a way that is expressive more of what is eternal, I will exist more in this eternal way. So it's obviously it's a strange way of thinking, but I think one way of trying to make it somewhat more concrete is the way that so some people talk, okay, he's talking about love, the way that some people think of, okay, there's like this mystic love that you can think of where if you can approach this kind of level where you strip off individuality and particularity and you reach this kind of apex of the eternal, that love is something eternal and that can be shared beyond just my individuality, that I'm kind of grasping something that is universal and eternal with that emotion there. But then, there's a lot of problems, I think, trying to fully hammer that out. I'm mainly just speculating, but I don't know. Seems like he's got something like that in mind, this kind of idea of a kind of mystical love of God, eternity, by which we kind of participate in the eternal. And we can think of that as, okay, if I live in this way that I experience eternal love, I don't know, I'm some great Spinozist mystic or something like that, then in some sense, I persist in eternity. Where if I'm just completely dominated by the temporal, by the external causes and the accidents that happen to me, then I'm explained by all these temporal things. So when I die, that's everything pretty much. Or at least my essence would just be some kind of abstract eternity. It wouldn't be exercised at that point because of passive affections and all that good stuff. But I don't know. Does that seem to be coherent at all? At least not as like, oh, I believe that or whatever, but as just trying to articulate a concept that I think Spinoza is hinting at least.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense.
It's your voice is breaking up.
Kind of a question that's kind of coming to mind.
You sound like a robot, a heavily sedated robot.
Or a stuttering robot.
He's lagging so hard he can't even hear us.
I'm wondering maybe what Spinoza's
We cannot hear you. Assuming you are still trying to talk, but yeah. Oh, Robo Joey. Oh, what a tragedy.
Well, maybe it's the introduction to the singularity.
So while we're waiting for Joey to come back, so it seems to be one big, tell me if I'm wrong, Chase, that one big difference between Spinoza and Plato is that, for Plato, there are these essences that are absolutely universal. So like there's the essence of the human, and we all participate in the essence of humanity. But it seems like for Spinoza, every individual has their own essence. And that essence is constituted, like you say, from what you're saying, each individual essence is constituted by that set of relations or proportions or, differential relations or whatever. But that, I guess, maybe is it a general notion? You could take common features of a bunch of different ones of those and call those common features an essence of the type of human or something. But that doesn't, am I right? That doesn't actually exist in any real way. It's a conceptual abstraction. But what has a kind, again, exists is not the right word, but what has this eternal mode, I don't know what words to use, but anyway, this eternal thing is the particular essence of these sets of relations for each individual. And this, if you want to talk about the essence of humanity, like Plato would, I'm guessing Spinoza would say that's an abstraction. It's fine to talk that way, but that doesn't have this kind of eternal persistence that these individual essences have. Is that correct?
Yeah. So he thinks of essences as singular. So that's definitely quite a deviation from Plato. And yeah, he talks about the abstract universals. And I think he would say that some of the way that Plato thought of some essences in that way, that he would say that that is just kind of an abstract universal. And then the common notions, though, you can see they have this kind of medial existence between those. So that would be, they're between essences in a way. So this would be a rational knowledge of how essences can agree that isn't itself knowledge of the essence. Instead, you first understand agreements as far as they relate to your own essence. So it'd be, okay, so it'd be something like my own body, how it agrees with some, I don't know, food. I first have to understand enough of myself and my essence, just enough to know how that agreement can occur between some particular other thing. So that would work kind of in between. That agreement itself isn't a singular essence, but it's between. It's a relation, I guess, particular kind.
So would that then have an eternal, again, I don't know what, I can't really use the word existence, but would that have some kind of eternal status, kind of like, my essence is this relational stuff? Would he say then that those various agreements are also similarly a set of relations that then have this kind of eternal status as well?
Yeah, that part is difficult. I was trying to figure that out, and it seems like on one level there is a kind of eternity that does correspond with the common notions, but it seems to be distinct from the eternity of essences. So I mean, this is kind of I don't understand this. I think kind of in general, even when it comes down to the first kind of knowledge. So because God has those ideas too. So if I have an affection, some passive affection, like a basketball like comes and hits me in the face, what is that? Where does that fit in with the idea of God and all this stuff? So that is explained by the fact that God would have the idea of myself along with these other ideas about the basketball, all these other causes. So, but it can't be explained by just my own essence alone, my getting hit by the basketball and the effect that happens. So it needs to be explained with a bunch of other things. But then it seems like, okay, so we've got a kind of relation of essences also kind of occurring there as far as the affection occurs in the intellect of God, or the idea as it exists in God, or so, yeah, I'm not sure exactly the way he phrases those things. It seems like there is an aspect of the eternal that also has to occur with that. At least it seems like to me. I don't know. I think maybe Spinoza would disagree in some ways and say that, oh, no, that's explained by things occurring in duration and time. The basketball, hitting my face does not explain anything, any eternal truth kind of in itself. But I don't know. I could see how someone could probably argue against that, but I don't know. Then the second kind of knowledge I think he says somewhere in this fifth section that there is a kind of eternity that corresponds with them as far as the idea is expressed but through the idea of God. But then I think that's probably insofar as it is an agreement between essences. So I think he would say something like, okay, yeah, between the eternal essences, you've got some kind of eternity for the common notion there, but then also it's not it's an adequate idea, but it's not an adequate idea that's like this third kind. They're explained differently. They're, if anything, their causes are different, and that seems to be a pretty major way of. So that's how Spinoza talks about how does this determination occur with these ideas of God and whatnot. Usually, it's if you understand something through the cause, you understand that the cause kind of contributes these certain properties onto the things it causes. And yeah, so that's one way of possibly trying to understand it. I don't know. This section is quite complex. I do not claim to understand everything.
When you were speaking, the last things you were saying, the last interpretation, is it on the Penguin, page 174, proposition 29 and 30, he uses the phrase species of eternity. Whatever the proposition 29, whatever the mind understands under a species of eternity, it understands not from the fact that it conceives the body's present actual existence, but from the fact that it conceives the body's essence under a species of eternity. And then Prop 30 says, insofar as our mind knows itself and the body under a species of eternity, it necessarily has knowledge of God and knows that it is in God and is conceived through God. So I thought that was fitting in your interpretation of what Spinoza was saying.
Yeah, it is something eternal. Yeah.
But also making a distinction saying it's not about the body's present actual existence. That's what I thought was important in Proposition 29. To me, he's making an opposition, a separation from the two.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I thought was interesting is that it seems to be so not only the traditional way of thinking of the afterlife, it's usually connected with this idea also of the soul as distinct from the body. And in these certain way, I think, Descartes really expressed it probably in the most pure fashion where, okay, the mind is indivisible. That's why it's eternal. And so you've got this soul that is, eternal in this kind of traditional Christian way. And that, of course, you got substance dualism. The body is divisible. So that isn't eternal. So the body can die, but the soul will live on. Aren't those lyrics for the Titanic song? Yeah. And the same, so Plato says the same thing roughly about soul being eternal and whatnot, and the body as something that's kind of gets in the way. And it's obviously going to be connected with the temporal. That's pretty traditional way of thinking about that. The mind is usually conceived, the mind, the soul, the intellect, eternal, indivisible, active, masculine, and then this traditional association, then you get the material world of change, and that's going to be, something that is not eternal. and something we need to transcend for, at least for Spinoza, not for Spinoza, for Plato, for all, pretty much the whole kind of squad of traditional immortality kind of tradition, the whole thinking of that. So Spinoza, he differs from that in that he thinks there's an aspect of the mind that is, for the most part, relatively indivisible, but there's also a complex aspect of the mind as far as it exists, and that is divisible. So there's extensive parts there, they can be divided. So, and the same thing with the body. The body has divisible parts, but also an indivisible essence with it. So he's got, this kind of 4-part thing going on, where usually you've got just one aspect of the mind, indivisible, one aspect of the body, divisible. He's got divisible and indivisible on both sides corresponding with each other. So the fact that he's saying that there's aspects of the body that are eternal, and also, the fact that he's saying that aspects of extension and corporeality are parts of the divine was a pretty controversial thing to say in 17th century. But yeah. So then he also talks about this. I think, even though he doesn't really obviously explicitly go after, Descartes or Plato or whatever in this, but then he, towards the very end, he gives this account of the usual conviction of the multitude, these absurd opinions that the masses have about, how we have to have morality and religion, and people have to believe in an immortal soul, otherwise they'll just go wild. I think that's pretty interesting, the context that appears. He's got this kind of, okay, now I'm going to go into this polemic about the common sense, common notion of, not common notion the technical sense, but the common opinion that is given of what is the function of religion, and where these traditional ideas of immortality, where do those tie in. Seems interesting that he kind of goes into that at the very end. It's definitely seems to be connected with the whole critique of traditional religion that runs through this entire book. But yeah, I don't know. Is Robo Joey gone?
I'm back.
Yes.
We couldn't understand.
Am I still Robo?
No,
you're
actually,
good now.
very clear.
Do you want to bring up whatever you were trying to bring up? Because we were not able to hear you.
Yeah, I don't know if it's I guess the question's kind of still there somewhat, and we'll see how it plugs into where the conversation's gone. But maybe 2 thoughts, because the point that Spinoza somewhat ends on, I did appreciate, about like the virtue not being this kind of external reward, but being kind of like, to live virtuously like is blessedness itself, as opposed to like the blessedness being like a reward for that. And I guess I'm wondering how that ties into that kind of idea of like living in line with one's essence, or kind of like living in the eternal. And I guess I'm recalling him talk about that, when you're living in the eternal, right, you're less kind of measuring your life, or your I don't know what word to use here, like well-being, power, like like I feel like can't use existence, but like this idea of like, it seems like he was saying that if you're living in this way, you're less afraid of death, because you have this feeling, right? I remember him saying something like, you have this feeling that that there is some sort of like eternity, that you're like, again, I don't know the language he would use, but that you're like getting in touch with. And I guess the question that was popping in my mind earlier was around like, what are Spinoza's intentions with this section, and wondering like, to what extent does it relate to like a usefulness towards life? Or, even at the end, like Chase, you're just saying like the point of religion. And I'm wondering like, what is the value or utility, or does there need to be a value or utility for this third kind of knowledge? And I guess the thought I was having earlier was like, is Spinoza trying to kind of give this reason of like, look, don't be afraid of death? And then like wondering like, why would he say that? At least that's the kind of message I'm getting from that last section, is that like, oh, hey, check it out. If you think this way, if you get to the third kind of knowledge, like, don't worry about dying so much. And then I guess the other thoughts that were kind of like in the background of that thought for me was, I can't remember if Spinoza himself talks about this or if Deleuze talks about it, and they're kind of blurred together for me. But the idea of like the common notions being like useful for us in the world in terms of like increasing our power, versus the third kind of knowledge being like less useful for like our power, but kind of having this different sort of value. I think I guess I'm wondering like, where does blessedness rank in terms of like utility of living a life, or say like increasing our power, as opposed to kind of like, I guess I was getting this sense that the common notions and the second kind of knowledge like help us kind of like maneuver between this like min max of like my power, versus like blessedness almost felt like this, almost like stepping out of this sense that like, oh, my power needs to be at the max all the time, but more so just, there's kind of just like this step back, and yeah, I don't know, like, I almost get this sense of like, and I guess, when I say like, oh, don't be afraid of death, I'd feel like I'm kind of connecting it to, just certain ideas of almost like acceptance. I don't know, Spinoza uses the term salvation, but just this sense of like, oh, I don't have to worry as much, like who cares about my power? And like, this intellectual love of God, like just being this kind of like different sort of mode. Yeah, I don't know, those are kind of some of the thoughts I had. I guess maybe to boil it back down to maybe the more specific questions, where utility or value of like blessedness in the third kind of knowledge in relation to the second kind. And then also, does Spinoza have some sort of like prescription for us, or like reason that we should strive for the third kind of knowledge? Does it involve like him trying to make some sort of argument that like, hey, don't worry about death? Or like, would that be trying to kind of like, I don't know, stop there.
So I remember him saying that, I believe you said this, that it's our highest virtue is blessedness, or this third kind of knowledge. And that, so I think the part about power that there's no increase or decrease kind of going on. I think in the third kind, that's more of a first, second. But for the third kind, it's a kind of full possession instead of your power, understanding, and all those synonyms that he uses. I think virtue as well. So this would be okay. I understand the third kind of knowledge. I understand this singular essence of myself, God, and things. And from that, I get also an affect that is a kind of joy, but it's accompanied with the idea of God as cause. So therefore, it's love, because the definition of love, remember, is joy accompanied by the idea of, well, I think an external idea. Is God an external idea? I don't know about that, but that's what he.
I think that was an essential point. I'm kind of recalling some of that too, that at least when it's accompanied by the idea of God, right, it's a little bit different in a way that kind of like doesn't equate it to being a passion, doesn't make it like a passion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because so the second kind is active. Those are active affects, follow from those as well. And the third kind do. So I think that's kind of, but the way that it's this kind of more thorough, more complete sort of affection of our own essence, where I think the common notion, the difference is that it's still somewhat indirect. You know, the way that I would agree with, I don't know, something, my cat, like my cat gives me joy. There we go, common notion. The way that I would conceive of that, it would still be a kind of indirect understanding of what my singular essence would be. So I think as far as that is concerned, you still say, okay, that's going to be still an increase in joy and power and all that good stuff, but it's not the same as a more thorough kind of top-down deductive way of understanding my singular essence, where it works through the attribute. So I adequately understand the attribute, extension or thought or whatnot. And then from there, I can understand the singular essence, where I think that distinction there is going to be also where you have distinctions with the affects, and then that's going to give you the distinctive features that are different about the third kind of affect, which is the highest form of joy, and that it's kind of this completion of it. At least I think that's what I remember, at least. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
To me, it helps answer the question of like increase and decrease, and I guess the difference between the third kind and the second kind.
Oh, yeah, the question of utility, though. So that I think. So he says virtue as this kind of quasi-utilitarian kind of definition that goes with it. I think he says that, okay, our virtue is, more fully realize the third kind than anything else, the second kind. But I can definitely see how, from the understanding of what's going on in the third, that concern with utility would drop away, and that so I mean, at least I think it was. So this would be an understanding of a kind of eternal necessity that goes along with, okay, if I understand how you have from the adequate idea of substance, God, nature, you get an attribute, and I can understand this unfolding of these adequate notions until I get to the singular essence of myself and something else. I would understand it as completely necessary as well as eternal. It seems like at that point, if anything, at least traditional notions of utility would definitely not apply there. I don't see how they would. But then by his notion of this kind of virtue of our advantage, I think it would be probably something along the same lines as, okay, well, what is to our advantage is, what increases our power, but then the third kind of knowledge, it's kind of a full possession of it in some sense. And therefore it's kind of a full possession of utility also to go with that. So
that it's making sense plugged into some of those last propositions where he's saying, like, because at least to me, like it made sense to kind of think of, oh, in the common notions, I'm like getting these notions and then using them to increase my power. As it, there's kind of I guess it makes it sound like there's like this external reward. And I guess to his point about like virtue and blessedness, of him saying, it seems like the third kind of knowledge becomes no longer about like some sort of like external sense of utility, but it's just like, quote unquote, this full possession of it.
Yeah, so there's also this interesting aspect where, okay, so joy seems to be equivalent with activity, which is equivalent with being itself. So, that sounds pretty mystical, but it's kind of, okay, if I just simply come into possession of reality, knowledge, understanding, which is also being reality. Also, I have this possession of the highest level of joy because, in a sense, reality is joyful inherently. And I think that's kind of, that's why, not only that he's connecting affects with this kind of knowledge, like he's done the entire book, but that it kind of tops out at that apex simultaneously with, okay, I've got this top level of knowledge, got this top level of affect to go with it, but then his whole kind of metaphysics is aligned on also that convergence of, metaphysics or speculative and practical affirmation. I think I recall Deleuze using those words, which I think that's kind of what is kind of coming to an apex kind of with this third kind. Got this complete, absolute joy to go with it, to go also with this absolute realization of your essence, something like that. And then a full possession of virtue, which is talked about in utility, at least for the second kind, to the point where that utility almost stops making sense in the normal way we conceive of it. But then, I think it's kind of this way of thinking about, okay, because it is this joy, the goal is already within so there's no real goal that's external to it, like he's saying. And I think if you understand that the identity of being in joy and all those convergence points, if you understand that, you can see why he's saying, yeah, there's no external goal. It is itself the goal. Or no, I think you said the drop kind of talk about goals kind of in general. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I know we're approaching our last little 30 minutes. I guess if there's no other like maybe specific questions or thoughts, I'm kind of curious around just what everybody else kind of is taking away, or did Spinoza live up to what they thought of Spinoza, or how he kind of plugs into your interests, where he sits relative to what you would like to read. Do we like Spinoza? Question mark.
I mean, like, I think it's not as uncommon in Spinoza's day as I think it is now, but it was really interesting getting to see what like his take on what I would consider a non-imperative moral philosophy, where it's like this sounds like I'm making fun of him. I'm really not, but it feels like he's saying like, okay, listen, all this moral nonsense, who cares about any of that? Like, if you guys want to be happy, if you want to live a good and fulfilled life, here's some tips on how to do that. Welcome to the Spinoza self-help book. And I think coming into it, I had more of an expectation that it was going to be, for lack of a better word, like contentious. Like, there are obviously things I disagree with. There's things that I don't think are adequately substantiated enough, things that are proposed as essentially truisms that I don't think are true. But all in all, as a whole spectacle and affair, I think it was a pretty good read, and one that I'm more happy to have read than I would have been if I had skipped out on it or something. So.
Spinoza is one of those many people that I didn't know much about, that I felt obligated to know more about. I'm happy to have gone through this. I find him interesting enough to where I would actually like to understand him better. I don't know if I will have the discipline to actually make good on that, but I think he says enough interesting things that it would be, I would like to understand him better, understand his ideas, like these questions and problems. Does he have solutions to them, or does he not? And what do people say? So I find him interesting enough to want to know more. I think, like a lot of philosophers who kind of try to stake out an extreme position, whether I agree with it or not, it's extremely instructive to see someone, stake out some extreme and then try to justify it. And, so in the case of Spinoza, a thoroughgoing pantheism, I think that's a useful effort to try to do. Trying to, a thoroughgoing determinism and trying to look at the implications of that, I think is very useful. So there's certain things that he does that I think are really useful. It's a helpful project just in philosophy in general. If there's still one thing that there's a lot of things. I mean, a lot of things that I still wonder about, but one of the sort of standard problems with determinists or people who are close to determinism is, toward the end of the book, he's being kind of prescriptive. And, this is how you like Christian was saying, here's how you live a good life. But then, if you're a determinist, You know, how much do you really have to say about that? So you have this weird thing that goes on, that we have the perception of free choice, and I have the, you know, my subjective limited perception that I can make choices about how I live my life and how I'm going to, you know, whether I'm going to accept his recommendations or not. But then ultimately I was going to do that anyway. And so that's always a, you know, I mean, that's not at all a new problem, right? I mean, it's been around probably since the Greek atomists, but it still kind of fries my brain a bit.
Yeah, I mean, even in Greek tragedy, very old tragedy, one of the most common things is fate. And kind of there's all these kind of paradoxes about fate. And yeah, it seems like the idea's been around definitely a while. Yeah. So I just want to say, I think the Beth Lord book, the Guide to Spinoza's Ethics or whatever it's called, it talks about that problem, but it talked about it in a way that I had never seen before, which was interesting. That so usually I interpret it as, okay, so he's saying that freedom isn't a matter of a free will, isn't a matter of that you have a choice and that choice has no cause. It's just, you know, spontaneity from the noumenal or something like that. But instead, so Beth Lord, the way that she talks about it is interesting. That okay, so I thought of it as, yeah, we're still determined by things, you know, but we're not determined by our choices. But then she makes the point that, I mean, yeah, you're determined by your choices at the same time as all kinds of things, but that corresponds with other things, and that choice is itself determined. And so it was an interesting way of kind of thinking about that paradox where, okay, so Spinoza, like we don't have free choice, we don't have free will. The will isn't free, it's determined. But so the stakes of the game are, how do we determine ourselves to be free? And the way that you can think about it also as, well, how can I determine my choices in a way where I'm determined as free? I think that's another way of thinking about it, that the paradox is still kind of there, but I don't know. I like this idea of denial of free will. I think that's I would say I started reading this book, and I did not probably believe that, and I think I probably do believe that now. At least it seems plausible to me that, yeah, there's free will doesn't determine these things, that instead it's something closer to affections. That's what determines things. And we still have, who are we? You know, we're not our free will in this kind of uncaused sense, but we still have effects as bodies and minds and whatnot. And I think that is kind of the key, is this, you have to have this almost like gestalt shift of thinking of yourself in a way where you're not kind of thinking in terms of, I'm an ego, you know, making free will choices, but at the same time where you can think of that is still involved, but just as one determination among many others, which themselves have determinations. But instead it's about kind of like constructing your own circuit of determination for yourself, which requires a kind of, you know, it's almost like a salvific force from outside has to first determine you to even do something. You know, I have to I don't know, throw the ethics to you and be like, read this, and then maybe the ideas will affect you in a way that you can start to then have these choices that determine you in certain ways. But I don't know. I like this way of thinking much better than the normal kind of dichotomy of, free will that is completely, libertarian, uncaused, or this kind of fatalistic, mechanical way of thinking of determinism. It seems to be like he's saying something. I mean, it's closer, obviously, to that mechanistic kind of determinism. Obviously, he's definitely a determinist, but still something so. Yeah, I like that's definitely one of the ideas I've gotten from reading this that I did not have before.
Well, one thing that I found appealing, which we talked about last week in the notion of a way of thinking about freedom, is that he seems to associate freedom with knowledge, so that the more the more I know, the freer I am. And I tried to express this last time. So if I understand if I understand the forces that are impinging on me, I understand the causes of things that are happening to me. In a sense, I become master in the sense that I understand, I know what's happening, I get it, I can see these things happening. Whereas if I'm the passive recipient of affects, if things are affecting me and I don't understand why they're affecting me, then I experience that as being externally determined, because I don't understand what's happening. I'm being affected. Things are happening to me. And so I don't feel free, I feel determined. But if I have this kind of clarity and this understanding of all this stuff, then I can see, I understand, I get, I'm just repeating myself, but there's a kind of freedom in this knowledge of understanding these causes and so on.
I'm recalling him say that, where it's like we're less affected if we understand the necessity of things.
Yeah, I think that was one of the strongest parts of Spinoza that I could really make some sense of and put to work. Neville was just saying about, understanding being kind of a path towards like a more active stance towards the world, right? Because you're understanding it, you're less affected by things. And for me, I saw, again, I saw this as kind of pre-Kantian notion of freedom, right? That kind of feeds into Kant, right? For Kant, we're only free insofar as we use our reason. And it's not a matter of arbitrary choice. It's doing what reason dictates. Which there's a lot here that's consonant with Kant, but at the same time, like to kind of address Joey's first point, I've come over the course of this reading, I've come to really appreciate Spinoza. He's probably one of my favorite pre-Kantian philosophers. And kind of building off what Nevitt said, his experiment in pantheism, I find really interesting, and plausible at a certain level, right? And I say at a certain level because he's he's a pre-critical philosopher. There's something about what Kant's project is that for me is kind of irreversible, right? So I'm still, just to put it in another slightly provocative way, a lot of the back and forth about free will versus determinism, right, from a Kantian perspective is like, why are we still enmeshed in this? Are we gonna argue about the existence of God next? Or can we move to something else, right? But from a pre-Kantian perspective, a very good coherent theory. It's really interesting, and like I said, some really good insights that you can put into your living as well, kind of building off what Christian said. I would push back though, the way he characterized it in terms of Spinoza saying this morality business, you don't need it, or something like that. He does seem to talk about morality towards the end there as something that we all need to build into our way of living.
I agree he does do that. I just don't know if he does it sufficiently enough for me to buy it, I think would be the best way to put it. But, we could debate about that another time.
Maybe he has a different notion of morality than
I think the way I put it originally, that it is very distinctly not a duty ethic. And this kind of is like going into more of like an interest I have specifically in ethics as like I wouldn't say like a research focus really, but something I'm always keeping my eye on is who chooses to go the route of duty ethics and why. Because I think this may be a little cynical too, but I think a lot of people, a lot of thinkers and writers kind of have an intuition as to which way ethics is going to pull. And Spinoza didn't really, it's certainly not a duty ethic as I would normally classify it. And I think that choice was informed by a lot of his prior observations and intentional to the extent that you couldn't have anything like Spinoza otherwise. I don't know. That might be a decent way of getting across what I'm trying to say. So that's why I said it wasn't meant to be an insult, the whole like self-help book thing. But it's like when you compare a lot of moral philosophers, they're like, you must live this way. It is your moral imperative that you live this way. And Spinoza's like, hey man, listen, I've got all these great reasons why I think you should. But at the end of the day, if you just want to like be at the whims of your affects, like, hey,
Yeah. That is a tricky question because he seems to do a little bit of both, kind of. He almost seems to give a kind of gesture, a formal gesture of being like, oh, and I'm doing morality. So I'm saying, yes, be virtuous, but I think kind of when it comes down to it, what he's doing is something that is quite different from a kind of the term imperative morality. I think he's doing something different from that, which I mean that's one of my favorite things about Spinoza, I would say, is if you can have an ethics without an imperative or something like that, I like that idea a lot. And so I think another thing about the ethics, the axiology, kind of what's going on here, so the way that there's no moral blaming of persons, that is one of my favorite things ever in existence. I hate the idea of morally blaming people. I think it's fucking disgusting. I hate it so much. So the fact that there's none of that, we're determined in these ways, you can work within that, and really, you probably should, there's nothing that's saying you have to, but the way that he gives kind of these options for this is better, this can increase joy and power, and this makes for a more rational society, blah blah blah, but then that it isn't something where, oh yeah, it's all about you as a person and you have to decide these things and you're responsible. That I like that a lot. And I think that's why you can say that he is very much challenging typical notions of ethics to the point where it's kind of would probably be unrecognizable to, I think, a lot of those notions. But then I don't know. I don't I think because I have this kind of, I don't know, innate disgust of kind of I mean, it's kind of the same thing that Nietzsche, I think, is polemically railing about, is this kind of uh, morality as the judgment of people, and that kind of thinks of this idea of a subject that's equal to that can be blamed. I think that is yeah, that's why I do not tend to like morality is a bad word in my mind. It's a very bad word. Or ethics, maybe I can do something with that. Especially if it's you know, saying that, okay, yeah, it's not about you and your free will, but instead, yeah, you might want to try to, regulate some of the affects and sadness and some things like that. I can work with that. So yeah, that's definitely one of my favorite things about the ethics. But the way that goes along with Nietzsche, I think, is just it's very, very appealing to me. But yeah.
So yes to ethics, no to morality.
Yep. Yeah, pretty much.
And from Eric's point of view, duty is okay only if it's a duty to fight oppression.
Well, I mean, Kantian, right? So duty to honor and respect the fundamental dignity and worth of the human being.
I guess the problem comes with the implication of a duty. Like it's not that the duty in a vacuum is some like bad thing, but what it does is it lets you point the finger and be like, you are a person who is not doing their duty. That's bad, and you're a bad person because of it. I generally, I kind of brought this up before. I'm kind of like a mind agnostic person in general, but I'm pretty leaning towards the determinist camp even before I read this. And it was interesting to me that, Spinoza didn't try some like compatibilist, like this is more just talking about macro ethics. I think as the more I learn, read, study, and engage with, the more I start to feel like the idea of moral condemnation, like you were talking about, Chase, it doesn't really serve a purpose. Just a short story. The other day, one of my dogs, actually it was my neighbor's dog, but they broke a fence, right? And everybody just lost their freaking minds about it, right? They were like, oh my God, the fence is broken. We're all just going to be super mad. And the only thing I could see in my mind was like, why don't we just fix the fence and move on with our lives? Like, do what we have to do to solve the problem and move on. And I think to me, that's kind of what I want out of an ethical theory. It's like, what do I need to do to solve the problem that we've been presented with, and then let's go about our lives. Like I don't, but yeah, I mean, I'm kind of just parroting some of the things he already said. So
yeah, I think that is very Spinoza's also, especially the way that it's dogs, and that people usually will give dogs, a free pass is they don't have free will. So, but
well, it was the humans that were mad at each other, to be fair.
Exactly.
But,
yeah. Damn humans. Yeah.
Yes, damn humans.
I don't know, Ed, did you have how does Spinoza strike you? Anything in particular?
I'm really glad we read this work. And I don't feel comfortable entirely because even though I've known of them, and most people, if they refer to them all, have this sense of just described in terms of pantheism. And to me, there was I'm just thinking about when he was writing, the world he lived in, and even if it's Amsterdam, which was quote unquote free, or from so many other parts of Europe, it's it just it's just interesting to me how he could have wrote something like this at that time. And just thinking what if somehow he, and I know this is stupid to say, so I apologize ahead of time, but I'm gonna say it anyway. But if he was born, 200 or 300 years later, and he had the benefit of reading Kant and reading Hegel and reading, just a whole bunch of, I mean, it just seems like he's thinking very, very seriously about a range of subjects. And to me, even if I can disagree with him on things, it seems to me he's trying to be very serious about it, and not taking any cheap shots.
One thing kind of in reference to his biography that I think about, at least, that he died in his early 40s when, and of course, the climate, even in, a relatively free Amsterdam or Netherlands, there's still a lot of obstacles, but the fact that he died very young, when a lot of philosophers don't really get going until about that age. But he wrote, I think it was something like 15 years to write this book, which, so obviously he started very young. You think about it, that this is it's his magnum opus, of course, but at the same time, it's kind of because he died. That's why he didn't write anything else. But I wonder about, this isn't very Spinoza's to wonder about these things and not just take them as necessary and whatnot. But what if he had not died from inhaling, bits of glass or whatever, and instead wrote more? I wonder what would happen. Yeah,
that's a good point.
Yeah, his life is definitely very interesting. There's so in the Deleuze book, the small one, it's definitely more practical. Spinoza Practical Philosophy. The first chapter is this very short thing on the life of Spinoza that is, it's kind of cute. Kind of doesn't go into a bunch of detail. I think it's like maybe less than 10 pages, but I only talk shit about Hegel in it. It's probably worth reading for that. Don't tell Hunter I said that. But yeah. By the way, I think if you want to look for some additional sources in Spinoza studies, and you are interested in Deleuze, especially considering we read Anti-Oedipus before this, I would definitely start with this one, the small one, Practical Philosophy. So there's part of it is a dictionary style format. You don't necessarily have to read the whole dictionary, front to back, but there's also these little essays in here too, that I would recommend. They're pretty accessible. So yeah, if you want to get some familiarity with people's takes on Spinoza, I would recommend that.
What's funny is I thought that dictionary section would be helpful, and that was the most difficult part of that book.
Oh yeah,
his
definitely.
definitions, it was like reading Deleuze. But his chapters, little essays, were nice. And to be honest, the expressionism book, a lot of it got pretty dense and in depth. But there's I think there's 3 parts of it, and the last part of it, which is composed of maybe, I don't know, say 4 chapters, was very digestible and very interesting, which it focused primarily on I think the last part is titled like the finite modes. But it just kind of, I feel like it zoomed out enough to give just some of these more general Spinozist ideas, and as opposed to like the technicalities of essences and stuff like that, which definitely was kind of beyond me, which the first parts focus on a lot more.
Yeah, the first part of that book is definitely parts of it are rather brutal. But that third part on finite modes is definitely much more interesting. I know that he said that was what he was really interested in with Spinoza, was his concept of modes. But he's also interested in this immanence, univocity, things like that. But yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel so biased. I think when it comes to Deleuze, that it's hard to recommend. Like, I don't know, but I did it. I recommended it. So yeah. So there's other kind of takes on Spinoza other than Deleuze, of course. But I don't know. So I read Beth Lord's guide, and that was really, really, really helpful. Very helpful. I don't know if that would work necessarily kind of just on its own. It's really something that just works while reading the ethics. But I don't know. If anybody reads the ethics again, first of all, I salute you. But I would definitely recommend that Beth Lord book. Definitely helped a lot. It explains things in a much more cogent manner. Because I started off, I've read those Deleuze books before and was only kind of reading parts of Spinoza. And so just reading Spinoza all the way through and just focusing really on Spinoza was itself a new experience. But then it was definitely made easier with Beth Lord's guidebook. So, which I did recommend at the very beginning.
I find it very difficult to discipline myself to read secondary or guidebooks after we're finished with the books. So I've learned to just read as much secondary while we're reading it, because I feel like it keeps me in check, keeps it interesting.
Yeah, same here. I can only do it simultaneously, because otherwise, yeah. Why else would I do it? Yeah. Oh yeah. So okay, so it is 8:04. So I think I can so Joey, you put something in the Discord about Schopenhauer and secondary sources. So I don't necessarily know any kind of that I'm at least familiar with off the top of my head. But I'll say that I think Schopenhauer he's relatively easy to understand himself. So it's not as important for, I would say it's more important for Spinoza to have a secondary source than Schopenhauer.
That's kind of what I thought, but I think I'm just really interested in, usually I might try to get like a guidebook for the text we're reading, but since I do have that impression of Schopenhauer, I'm curious to get a secondary text in general that might just kind of bounce him off of like Eastern thought, Buddhism, so that I can kind of almost get a little wedge into some of that. And I know Schopenhauer is associated with that kind of stuff.
There are a number of secondary sources on Schopenhauer if you just kind of, look for them. And there are at least chapters in some of these books that are on his relationship to Buddhism. So there's actually, and also just papers if you just search for papers. So there's actually quite a lot of literature out there. It's just, I'm not, reason I didn't respond is all I know is there's a lot of literature out there, but I don't know any of it well enough to recommend one over the other. But I mean, one of the
Yeah, I
standard
think
things
that's where
that
I'm stuck. On
What's that?
whether I should go paper.
Oh.
I think that's where I'm stuck. Whether I
Yeah.
should go books or paper. And if anybody had any insight.
One of the standard sources I tend to recommend by default are the Cambridge Companions. And, there's a Cambridge Companion to damn near everybody, and there's one for Schopenhauer. So that, because the Cambridge Companions tend to, they're anthologies from a bunch of different people, and they tend to be topical. So I haven't looked at the one for Schopenhauer, but I'm pretty confident that they would like have a chapter on his relationship to Buddhism and a chapter on his
Pretty
relationship
sure
to Kant.
one of the Cambridge Companions is actually by one of the translators.
Oh, it could be.
So
Yeah, that's my thesis advisor.
So Alistair did the Cambridge Companion for Schopenhauer?
Yeah, I think he edited
Okay.
it, I believe.
I'm at Tai Chi, so I'm gonna jump off. I really liked our text, and I look forward to seeing y'all in a few weeks.
Okay. We'll see you then.
Bye.
I think Schopenhauer will be much fun. I couldn't help but crack open the book whenever I got them. And the Inferno. This is such a nice copy of, the Divine Comedy, all of them. But I started reading through the beginning. I haven't read the Inferno in years. So like going through it, I was like, oh, this is going to be so good.
I haven't either. It's been many, many years. I made it through the Inferno, and I couldn't go any further. So I'm glad to be with the group of people who are going to exert some accountability on me.
So I think I was a senior when I started reading the Inferno, and then I got a copy of the Cliff Notes and finished it out that way. And that was the last time I had an encounter with Dante. Yeah, I wish I could participate in that, but I probably should at least nominally be trying to do my thesis, but
Lame.
yeah.
You don't want to let it get it away from you.
Yeah.
Well, the story in my case, because I told it so many times, but they had to threaten to kick me out without a degree to get me to finish mine. So they literally sent me a letter and said, "You're going to finish this semester or we're throwing you out of the program." It's like, okay, I guess I'll finish.
Do you know how many semesters it was before they did that?
This was a PhD. I'm glad there's just 4. Oh wait, this is recording, so let me stop this.